Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short. Glad to have you along for the journey today as we talk about contemporary cultural issues from a Christian viewpoint. Now, I have to keep saying this because a lot of pastors and a lot of churches and a lot of Christians say, well, forget about those cultural issues. Just focus on personal, family, the friendship groups that you have, focus on the church community, just focus on these internal, personal, near you issues, because those other things out there in the culture, those things are going to come and go. Those things are going to have division and argumentation, and they're going to cause conflict, and people are going to be offended and alienated. So just stay away from all those social issues, the issues of the day that the networks and the news media and people talk about at work and are in the headlines of the newspapers and news magazines. Forget about all that stuff. That just causes division within the church. And just focus on personal relationship with God and those kinds of things. And don't bring in those external cultural issues, because that will, again, split the church, cause division, cause Christians to differ, alienate people, broken fellowship, all kinds of things like that. Well, I have to totally disagree with that, because one of the main factors about these cultural issues, I'm talking about the moral and spiritual cultural issues, those things affect Christians, whether churches and pastors want to acknowledge that or not. The social and moral issues of our day, the thing that are in the headlines and people are talking about at work and all over the place and on social media and so forth, these things affect Christians. They affect Christian discipleship. If you're a pastor and you seek to disciple a group of Christians within the church, you are going to have to deal with these moral, social, and cultural issues. You cannot ignore them. Now, a lot of pastors try to ignore them. For example, on the issue of abortion, we won't talk about abortion. That's divisive. I don't want to get into politics. I've heard pastors in front of large crowds say, when they mention something connected with abortion, I don't want to get into politics. And whatever side of the aisle you're on, Republican or Democrat, I don't want to deal in politics. Let's stick with the gospel. Let's stick with the Bible. The thing is, the Bible teaches us how to think and feel about these moral issues, because they're moral issues. Now, I'm not talking about these petty political issues. I'm not talking about issues that are not necessarily moral, that aren't necessarily put forth as spiritual. I'm not talking about, for example, what the interest rate at the Federal Reserve Board should be. I mean, these are things that good people can differ on, and there isn't any moral command in the Bible that addresses them specifically. But there are all kinds of social, cultural, political issues that the Bible talks very specifically about. There's no if, and, or buts about it. For example, in defining marriage, the Bible defines marriage as the union of a man and a woman. That is the only definition that fits the biblical categories. So this is very, very clear. So if there's a cultural issue, for example, on the so-called, quote, gay marriage, well, it's a no-brainer for Christians. Why is it a no-brainer? Because we have the Bible already defining this issue. So when we talk about cultural and moral issues, we have to say, yes, they're very, very, very important, and we can't ignore them. So that's why I interact with cultural, moral issues, because it is a form of discipleship. Whenever we help Christians think through these issues, it will not only help our society, it will help our churches. It will help our individual Christian living, because then we'll be consistent. And that's the goal of Christian discipleship. We want to have everything in our life consistent with the New Testament Christian message of biblical truth. We want to have our lives consistent. That's the key to discipleship. And if you're not consistent, then you run into a problem Jesus condemned in the Pharisees, and that is hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is basically, boil it all down, inconsistency with teachings. So if the Bible teaches a certain way and you are professing that, but then you're living another different way, that's inconsistency. Okay, that has to be eliminated. That has to be gotten rid of. Why? Because you're being a hypocrite. And that's what Christ condemned. So that's a sin of hypocrisy. It's also something that Christians need to hold each other accountable to. If you recall in the book of Galatians, Paul talks about he had to rebuke Peter, the apostle. Now, Peter was one of the, if not the leading apostles and disciples, and yet he had to be held accountable by the apostle Paul because why? He was inconsistent. He was not living according to the teachings consistently. He was living in hypocrisy, and the apostle Paul called him out for it. So that's what we have to do as Christians. Now, all of that leads up to say I was able to finally, after months and months and months of hearing about, I was able to finally view and watch the documentary called The Jesus Music. And I have done a video in the past about the trailer, the preview of the Jesus Music. And I finally got to sit down and watch the whole thing. And I want to give my review and impressions of the Jesus Music. It's dealing with the history of contemporary Christian music. And I happen to have lived through most of the history and the development of contemporary Christian music, or popularly known CCM, Contemporary Christian Music. There's a magazine, CCM magazine, Contemporary Christian Music magazine. And so that is why I was so interested in this documentary, because I actually have lived through pretty much the entirety of contemporary Christian music in the sense of the modern Christian music that has come up after, say, like during the 60s and onward. So I was interested in watching this. Now, the first thing I wondered was the historical summary presented in the Jesus Music, was that historical summary accurate? Because basically they go through from the very beginning, what they call the very beginning of Christian rock music or contemporary Christian music or modern Christian music in the late 60s and go onward, and they touch on a number of different bands and singers and Christian musicians. And I was wondering, were they actually accurate in their tracing of the historical development of contemporary Christian music? I think they pretty much got it right, although it would have been nice for them to have actually worked from a book or a scholarly historical write-up of contemporary Christian music. They actually went to people in the music industry, the contemporary Christian music industry, and some of those who were in on the early formation of contemporary Christian music from their perspective. But I wish they had sat down with an academic who had actually written a book or had actually done a total thorough study of the subject, as any historian would, of any period in the history of, say, a country or the world, and sat down specifically and traced it that way. So I have my doubts. I wonder if it was actually historically balanced in its portrayal of the development of contemporary Christian music. And it also emphasized a number of artists and gave them almost a dominant feature in this movie, and that is Amy Grant, Michael W. Smith, and the DC Talk group. And I kind of wondered why they emphasize those three artists so much. I can understand, say, for example, Amy Grant. She had a big part in the development of contemporary Christian music, as did Michael W. Smith. I don't know if DC Talk actually had that as much as the movie seemed to emphasize. but that can be something that historians can debate one way or another. But in fact, I wish they would have had historians from, say, some of the Christian colleges or seminaries that are all over the nation of the United States, and actually had a room full and say, was this movie balanced and fair in its historical depiction of contemporary Christian music? Now, another thing that struck me in the movie, the documentary, was that and this was a negative, I have to say, it depicted certain Christian artists as victims of a mean Christian and church environment. And why do I say that? Because, for example, they did describe the situation back, I think it was 20 years ago, when Amy Grant, who was one of the big contemporary Christian artists at the time, she got a divorce from her husband and then almost immediately, married Vince Gill. So here is a Christian woman singing, worshiping, and being almost the poster girl for the contemporary Christian movement. And then she up and gets a divorce and then immediately remarries a famous and legendary country and western singer. Well, that's great for her, I guess, if all that matters is her happiness and her fulfillment. But churches, logically and reasonably push back on that and say, well, wait a minute. And some Christian radio stations took her music off the air. Some venues would not allow her to do concerts. And the Christian world was really processing what was going on. Here was a supposedly evangelical Christian woman, and yet she's divorcing rather casually, it seems, and then remarrying rather casually also. And that is just not what Christianity teaches one should do. And so very reasonably, churches and pastors and youth leaders were questioning the wisdom of that and even the morality of that in doing what she did, just basically divorcing and then remarrying immediately. And there was some reluctance on the part of Christian leaders and Christians in general to embrace her change. And the movie, the documentary, actually portrays Amy Grant as a victim who had to suffer through bigotry and narrow-mindedness. And she faced persecution, and it caused her pain. And there were only a few Christian artists who would welcome her back and bring her back into the public light. And they went through a whole story about her trials and tribulations, about her divorce and remarriage and everything, depicting her, casting her as a victim. And that is not accurate. That is not accurate. She became someone that people weren't quite sure about because of her actions, not because of Christians and their puritanical standards. We're trying to be consistent Christians, and we really don't know what to do with someone who just divorces and then remarries quickly like that. And it would be anyone, and it has been other people in the Christian world who have done the same, and Christians are reasonably reluctant to want to embrace everything that these Christian artists are doing. And it also depicted some of the other Christian artists who fell into sin. For example, Michael English committed adultery in his marriage and was dropped by a lot of Christian labels, and it was difficult for him to find places to play his music. Well, that is a consequence of sin, and you can't blame it on the Christian community, and you can't blame it on pastors and churches. If you have to blame anyone, blame the individual who did something wrong. And we still believe as Christians that this is wrong. Adultery is wrong. The Bible teaches that it's wrong. So these Christian artists, they want to try to say that the fans or their audience or those who buy their material should be willing to go with them through the ups and downs of life and be able to forgive and forget. Well, yeah, we would, but there has to be a reckoning, there has to be repentance, there has to be a confession, and there has to be then a time of testing to see if this actually is a true confession and true repentance. And then, even then, it may not be the case that the artist will be embraced in the same way that he was before. That's not to say that one can't be forgiven and be restored. It's just a matter of you cannot play the victim in a scenario where you are the cause of your own problems. And so people like, for example, Sandy Patty. Sandy Patty, again, popular Christian artist, commits adultery. And this has been a problem in the Christian contemporary music scene of worship leaders, contemporary Christian artists, singers. They become very, very popular, and yet they have no accountability structure. A lot of these bands, a lot of these singers, they go on the road, they're touring, they're living the rock lifestyle, if you will, and there's no accountability. Many of them are not even members of a church. They don't even have any kind of pastoral or eldership accountability. They're not under any supervision. They go out on the road, they're touring, they're flying here in planes and touring in a touring bus, and they're living a lifestyle that does not lead to stability, that does not lead to accountability, and then they fall into sin. And lo and behold, the Christian community is very reluctant to embrace them again. Well, that makes sense. And so they cannot play the victim after they have sinned, they have fallen, and they have disappointed people, and then they cannot come back and say, well, you guys aren't treating me as nice and kind as you once did. Well, it was your doing and your actions, so you have to take responsibility for those. I think, so if there's anything in the movie I would point out in this regard, it's that the movie kind of depicts the Christian artists as these victims of a mean Christian public at times. It also talks a lot about the different situations that occurred in the early days of the contemporary Christian music scene coming out of California during the 60s. But it does leave out some of the bad things that are kind of swept under the rug. For example, it does show the early Jesus movement where the hippies started coming to Christ in large numbers. And that's actually where the contemporary Christian music was born, out in California, affiliated with Calvary Chapel out there in Costa Mesa, California. And strangely enough, it's centered around, the early days centered around Chuck Smith, but also a young hippie named Lonnie Frisbee. Now, the movie doesn't go into it, but Lonnie Frisbee was a young hippie who actually looked a lot like Jesus and attracted a lot of the hippies to Calvary Chapel, to the church, to Chuck Smith's ministry, because he looked like Jesus would look and was depicted in artwork. And so people flocked to this, and that's where contemporary Christian music began. A band, Love Song, and Chuck Girard and some of the other artists came out of that movement. But the sad fact is this Lonnie Frisbee actually was not a qualified Christian leader. He should never have been put up in front of people to teach and preach. And eventually, at a very young age, he wandered off into immorality, sexual immorality, and then years later died of AIDS. So he must have been involved in homosexual activity. So here was a young man who was essentially used by the Jesus movement and was used by them to gather a lot of other hippies that looked similar to him. and had similar attitudes to him, and yet he basically fell away from the faith and ended up basically in disaster. But that wasn't mentioned in the Jesus Music movie, and that was kind of swept under the rug. So there's a lot of that kind of thing that's going on in contemporary Christian music. And the thing about it is that the Christian public, we love to hear the music, and we love to hear the praise and worship songs that have come out of the contemporary Christian music scene. But we also are aware that because there isn't that accountability, that a lot of these artists really do copy a lot from the world. If you look at the contemporary Christian music scene at the very beginning, it was basically taking the styles and the rhythms and the sounds that were going on around them, and then bringing them into the church and bringing Christian lyrics to these sounds and the very culture of the rock scene. So at the very beginning, there was a lot of borrowing from the culture. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong about borrowing a music style, certain sounds, use of certain instruments, vocal styles, and so on and so forth, and then bringing those into the church and using them for the Lord, evangelistically mostly, but bringing them into the church and bringing good, solid lyrics in. But contemporary Christian music, because it's not accountable, what often happens is that these musicians who start singing for Jesus in the early days, then they get the idea that they're going to cross over into mainstream secular, worldly music. And you saw what happened with, for example, Amy Grant transitioning from singing Christian worship and church music, beginning to move into a very worldly style and taking on not only musical styles, but taking on worldly attitudes and kind of styling themselves as just another artist in the world of music, and showing up at a lot of secular venues and singing with a lot of secular artists. And the music lyrics become less and less Christian and become more and more generic. And pretty soon, a lot of these artists are actually singing very little Christian content, very little actually helping build up disciples of Jesus Christ and encouraging Christians, and more just singing about general things that any mainstream pop artist would sing. And that is another problem because, again, you don't have the accountability in contemporary Christian music. And so you have people like Amy Grant crossing over into mainstream and then seeming to really like that and enjoying that and not staying focused on singing for the Lord, but really singing for the people. And so now in contemporary Christian music, you have a lot of artists who really are looking for an opportunity to actually break out into the mainstream secular culture. And it's almost as if they're using Christian music as a platform, as sort of a waiting period until they could actually really make it into the mainstream pop music culture. And that is really, really a bad thing, because what happens is if these artists do transition and cross over and into a more worldly style and attitude, they bring other people in the church and other Christians, younger Christians, along with them to become more worldly and have more of the non-Christian cultural assumptions and attitudes about life. And for example, you see the contemporary Christian music scene, they interviewed quite a few of the artists today, and lo and behold, they look just like the pop cultural musicians of the day. They all seem to like to wear longer hair, most of them. They all seem to like to dress in a real super casual way, even a homeless style. They follow the fashion trends of the world. They follow the hairstyles. They follow the way of thinking and talking. They get on that rock star track, and it seems like that is something that almost is hard to resist in the contemporary Christian world. So a Christian artist becomes big, they become popular, and then they start looking like a mainstream pop artist. Not Christian, but just generic mainstream pop artist. And they seem to find a comfort zone there. It's like, oh, I like this. And they interviewed people like Lecrae, who actually has pretty much crossed over into mainstream. And if you look at the lyrics, they're not as full of the Lord as they were before. And if you look at some of the other Christian artists, it's the same thing. So, yeah, the Jesus Music documentary, definitely, I think it's a good documentary to see for Christians, especially those like myself who have gone through the whole CCM history and lived through it and are basically front row seats to all of this. We saw when Amy Grant came up through the ranks of music. We saw Michael W. Smith. We heard DC talk. We were aware of bands that were coming and going and reforming. We saw the rise of the specifically sounds of like Chris Tomlin and some of the other, and even the bands that have arisen lately in the last decade or so, like a couple decades, Hillsong and Elevation Music and stuff like that. We've seen the whole thing. And it's interesting to kind of have a historical perspective on it all, but yet we really need to have a lot more thought and reflection on what is taking place in contemporary Christian music. And we need to have a little bit more discernment as to how we're going to hold these artists accountable. After all, these people have tremendous influence on especially young people. A lot of the Christian artists are actually more influential than their own local church pastor. And young people listen to these Christian singers and musicians and bands and take away what they say and are more influenced by them than the leading Christian leaders in our culture. And so they have great power and influence. And it says in the Bible, let not many of you be teachers because you'll be held to a higher standard. Well, we need to start thinking about how do we hold influencers in the evangelical world, whether they're Christian artists or Christian YouTube people or pastors, teachers, evangelists. How do we hold these people accountable so that they don't, if they go off track, take millions and millions of people with them because of their position in contemporary Christian music or whatever field it is. So this all needs to be thought through, and this all needs to be really taken into account so that we don't end up basically shooting ourselves in the foot by elevating certain people in the Christian music world that really shouldn't have a platform. And we shouldn't endorse them. We should actually be holding them accountable. So I hope all of you are able to see the movie Jesus Music documentary, and hope this has been something that stimulates your thought. We'll talk to you later next week. God bless.